Here is the rewritten version in professional, native U.S. English. The vocabulary has been elevated to be dramatic and engaging, while strictly adhering to YouTube's safety guidelines by using nuanced, non-violating descriptions for sensitive topics. The structure follows your formatting request exactly. Within the privacy of their residence, a confidential conversation fundamentally altered the trajectory for William and Catherine. The couple wrestled with burdensome reflections, cognizant that their verdict would transform far more than just their routine existence. This matter transcends mere obligation, nor is it solely regarding their public perception. They faced a predicament they never envisioned confronting, a deeply intimate issue bearing genuine emotional weight. This resolution was neither premeditated nor arrived at without difficulty. Yet, what force could compel them to finalize such a gut-wrenching determination? Accompany us as we uncover the details of this decree and the factors pushing them past the point of hesitation. The lights inside Adelaide Cottage glowed well past midnight, while William and Catherine lingered in their family room. The residents finally fell silent after settling their 3 children in for the night. The couple had been dancing around this dialogue for weeks, inventing pretexts to postpone what they mutually understood required immediate debate. With the palace now demanding a response, they could no longer evade the verdict that would redefine their family's entire destiny. The cozy space that typically served as their refuge now felt constricting, the gravity of their duty squeezing them from every angle. Catherine sat tucked into the corner of the sofa, still clad in the comfortable attire she had donned following the children's evening regimen. William strode back and forth near the window, periodically peering into the darkness as though seeking clarity within the shadows. Neither had reached for the tea that had turned ice-cold on the table separating them. The quiet lingered between them, heavy with all the sentiments they had been suppressing. These were the anxieties they had attempted to handle individually, rather than addressing them as a united front. This juncture had been unavoidable since the institution first submitted their petition 3 weeks prior. The choice before them necessitated a radical overhaul of how they reared their offspring, specifically George. The palace sought guarantees that would revolutionize their eldest son's daily reality, instituting rigorous instruction and duties that appeared impossibly burdensome for a boy of his years. William comprehended the logic underpinning the demand. His father and the senior counselors envisioned the monarchy's longevity and sought to guarantee adequate readiness. They cited historical precedents and pontificated on obligation and custom. However, seated in his own residence, contemplating his son slumbering undisturbed, those rationales felt remote. Catherine had dedicated the prior weeks to investigation and reflection, quietly consulting child development experts and observing George closely for any indicators of strain. She had noticed how he occasionally posed inquiries regarding his prospects that betrayed a level of consciousness no youngster should bear. The institution's proposition would fast-track every aspect of his life, dismantling the safeguards they had meticulously constructed around all 3 children. It would necessitate earlier and more frequent public engagements, a regimented curriculum with specialized concentrations, significantly less time for ordinary childhood pursuits, and diminished privacy even within their own walls. William had his own recollections to wrestle with. He recalled being at George's stage and sensing the crushing burden of anticipation. He recalled the sensation that his childhood was an event occurring to him rather than an experience he directed. He remembered his mother's endeavors to provide him with a standard existence and how those instances felt invaluable because they were so infrequent. He had sworn to himself that his own offspring would know a different reality and that he would discover a method to equilibrate duty with adolescence. Now that vow confronted its inaugural genuine trial, and he was unsure he possessed the agency to uphold it. The palace had positioned their petition as rational and imperative. They characterized it as strategic foresight rather than coercion, as readiness rather than forfeiture. Yet William and Catherine both grasped the actuality beneath the rhetoric. Acquiescing would signify surrendering authority over substantial facets of their children's lives. It would imply accepting that George's formative years would be sculpted by institutional necessities rather than parental intuition. It would mean conceding that their functions as future king and queen consort superseded their identities as mother and father. Catherine finally shattered the silence, her tone unwavering despite the sentiment fueling it. She articulated her apprehensions regarding the psychological toll, the forfeiture of golden years that could never be reclaimed, and the precedent they would be establishing for Charlotte and Louis. She spoke about the caliber of adults they aspired for their children to evolve into, and whether the institution's overture bolstered or sabotaged those objectives. She queried whether equipping George for the throne necessitated sacrificing his youth, or if there might be alternative methodologies the establishment had not contemplated. William listened without interjecting, hearing in her phrasing the identical dreads that had kept him sleepless for weeks. He contributed his own perspective, sculpted by lived history. The counselors could never fully comprehend. He spoke of the disparity between being reared for service and being dismantled by it. He depicted the solitude he had endured as a boy, the feeling that his existence belonged to the populace rather than himself. He confessed his terror that acceding to the palace's stipulations would fracture his bond with his children. He feared they would one day look back and question why he had not shielded them when he possessed the opportunity. The dialogue persisted as the hours drifted by, both of them orbiting the central dilemma from varying vantage points. They debated the potential repercussions of declining, including the disillusionment and exasperation it would ignite within the palace. They recognized the strain that would inescapably ensue, the insinuation that they were being obstructive or failing to grasp their obligations. They pondered whether compromise positions existed, perhaps partial accords that might appease all parties. Regrettably, each potential middle ground appeared to crumble under scrutiny, revealing itself as merely a more gradual route to the identical conclusion. As daybreak neared, they both realized the verdict had already been reached, perhaps before they had even taken their seats. They had been stress-testing their conviction, ensuring they could justify their option to themselves and one another. Now they simply required the fortitude to stand behind it. But would they possess the capacity to do so? The initial overture from the palace had arrived through official conduits. A meticulously drafted memorandum was delivered to William's private secretary 3 weeks prior to that midnight discussion between the pair. The dossier delineated an exhaustive strategy for Prince George's advancement, framed as progressive preparation for his eventual station. The terminology was deferential, yet the presumption was unmistakable. The king and his senior aides had reached a conclusion regarding how the subsequent generation should be groomed, and they anticipated compliance rather than discourse. King Charles had followed up with a confidential dialogue regarding the proposal in the context of heritage and continuity. He spoke of his own grandfather's philosophy regarding royal schooling and the remorse he harbored concerning specific facets of his own upbringing. He positioned the plan as learning from historical missteps while revering essential customs. He underscored the significance of commencing early, of instilling proper disciplines and comprehension before the burden of actual command arrived. His demeanor was paternal and contemplative, making dissent appear not merely arduous, but somehow insolent. The proposition set forth a regimented agenda that would commence immediately and escalate over the ensuing years. George would attend designated functions selected for their educational merit, meeting Commonwealth dignitaries and partaking in ceremonial duties. His academic syllabus would integrate constitutional history, diplomatic etiquette, and leadership coaching. He would spend consistent intervals at Buckingham Palace, mastering the cadence and prerequisites of official royal existence. The blueprint even designated suitable recreational pursuits, favoring those that forged character and public favor over simple childhood amusement. Catherine had solicited clarification on numerous items, attempting to fathom the rationale and flexibility within the overture. The replies had been exhaustive but unyielding. The palace team had clearly invested considerable hours constructing their framework, and they presented it as a holistic package rather than a menu of choices. Suggestions for adjustments were met with expositions on why each component linked to others, why the timing was critical, and why alternatives had already been assessed and discarded. This was not a negotiation, but a presentation of institutional mandates. Behind the formal correspondence, other pressures had begun accumulating. Senior royals offered remarks during family congregations, observations regarding the significance of adequate readiness and the perils of being overly sheltering. The specific components of the proposal had been engineered by a committee of advisors, educators, and constitutional scholars. Media coverage began surfacing regarding George's future station, articles that appeared oddly well-versed in internal palace deliberations. The timing felt synchronized, designed to manufacture an environment where assent seemed unavoidable and resistance appeared irrational. William identified the tactic because he had witnessed it utilized throughout his existence. The palace possessed a particular proficiency at making their preferences feel like natural outcomes rather than enforced edicts. They constructed consensus through repetition and presumption by creating conditions where alternatives appeared not merely incorrect, but nearly absurd. They utilized loyalty and duty as leverage, making disagreement feel like personal inadequacy rather than a difference of perspective. The methodology was never aggressive or menacing, which somehow rendered it more potent. The proposal also arrived with implicit caveats regarding the fallout of delayed preparation. The advisors spoke of prior generations who had wrestled with their stations, suggesting that insufficient early training accounted for later tribulations. They referenced public expectations and constitutional imperatives, painting cooperation as essential rather than elective. They highlighted the king's personal investment in the strategy, clarifying that rejection would dishearten him during a period when father and son were striving to forge a more robust bond. Catherine had encountered the palace's persuasive machinery previously, but usually regarding her own role and duties. Observing them target her son triggered different instincts. She noted how the proposal regarded George as a future institution rather than a current child. She saw how it prioritized public optics over personal evolution, how it assumed that royal duty required childhood forfeiture. She recognized the identical patterns that had sculpted William's upbringing, packaged in contemporary vernacular, but built on the same archaic concepts. The financial implications added another tier of pressure. The proposal arrived with offers of supplementary support, expanded staff, and enhanced security protocols. Refusing would entail continuing with current resources while managing escalating demands. The palace framed this as benevolent assistance, but Catherine interpreted it as another form of strategic influence. Accepting their aid meant accepting their supervision, allowing institutional priorities to override parental choice in ever-widening spheres of family life. William had attempted to discuss modifications with his father during a private luncheon, suggesting ways to achieve the palace's aims while preserving more of George's boyhood. Charles had listened patiently, but ultimately reverted to the original framework. He spoke of his own endeavors to modernize the monarchy, the resistance he had encountered, and the concessions he had made. He suggested that William was being afforded opportunities for input that he himself had never received. The implication hung between them that further resistance would be viewed as obstinate rather than principled. The deadline for a response had been established with meticulous calculation. The palace required time to implement their plan before the next major royal event, where George's participation had already been slated. Stalling the decision would constitute a refusal, creating awkwardness and necessitating explanations. The timeline pressured William and Catherine to decide swiftly, limiting their capacity to explore alternatives or build support for a different approach. Every passing day brought new reminders of the pending answer, new subtle suggestions that cooperation was expected and delay was becoming conspicuous. Catherine had spent countless hours contemplating the type of mother she aspired to be long before she had children, and increasingly since becoming a parent. She had observed other royal mothers navigate impossible expectations, seeing how some had been critiqued for being too shielding, while others faced judgment for being too detached. She had studied child development through her early years initiatives. Now all that knowledge and instinct collided with institutional demands that seemed designed to subvert everything she believed about raising confident, balanced children. Her vision for George, Charlotte, and Louis centered on providing them the strongest possible foundation before gradually introducing the complexities of their royal stations. She wanted them to spend these early years forging genuine friendships, discovering their own interests, and developing the internal confidence that would assist them in handling public scrutiny. She believed that children who felt secure and cherished at home could better cope with external stressors later. Rushing them into official duties and formal training would manufacture anxiety and self-consciousness, replacing natural growth with performance. Catherine thought constantly about the specific ways the palace proposal would alter daily existence. George would need to maintain flawless deportment during longer and more frequent public engagements, understanding that any error would be photographed and dissected. His friendships would become complicated by security prerequisites and institutional oversight. His education would shift from child-centered learning to preparing for specific future responsibilities, with subjects chosen for their royal relevance rather than his natural curiosity. The impact on Charlotte and Louis worried her equally. The proposal focused on George, but its effects would ripple through the entire family. They would lose time with their brother as his schedule filled with special instruction and appearances. They would absorb the message that his life held more weight than theirs, that his needs came first in ways that transcended sibling dynamics. They would see their parents' attention divided, pulled toward managing George's increasingly complex requirements. The family unity Catherine worked hard to maintain would face constant strain. She had vivid memories of her own childhood, the freedom to be ordinary that had sculpted her into someone capable of eventually handling extraordinary circumstances. Her parents had shielded her from premature pressure, allowing her to develop at her own pace without constant performance anxiety. That foundation had proven essential when she entered royal life as an adult, giving her the internal fortitude to adapt while maintaining her sense of self. She wanted to give her children that same gift, believing it would serve them better. Catherine's conversations with child psychologists had reinforced her instincts while adding professional perspective. They explained how premature responsibility could create anxiety disorders and perfectionist tendencies. They described the importance of play in developing creativity and problem-solving abilities. They warned about the risks of children learning to perform rather than express genuine emotion, becoming skilled at masking their real feelings behind acceptable facades. Every expert conversation made the palace proposal seem more detrimental rather than less. Her concerns extended beyond childhood into the adults her children would eventually become. She wanted them to possess empathy born from genuine experience rather than trained responses. She hoped they would retain openness rather than developing the guardedness that often came from early exposure. She believed that future monarchs would need creativity and adaptability, qualities that flourished in supportive environments, but withered under constant evaluation and criticism. The palace's approach seemed designed to produce compliant figureheads rather than genuine leaders. Catherine had attempted to explain these thoughts to senior royals who supported the proposal but found herself speaking a different dialect. They valued tradition and preparation, viewing childhood as a training period rather than a precious phase deserving protection. They spoke about duty and sacrifice, as if those concepts were incompatible with happiness and normal development. They seemed unable to imagine that better-adjusted children might eventually become more effective royals, that protecting childhood could serve rather than conflict with institutional interests. The specific trigger for the current crisis involved a suggestion that George begin attending certain official functions alone, without his parents. The palace argued this would help him develop independence and learn to represent the family. Catherine saw it as forcing a child to manage adult situations without support, creating stress that served no legitimate purpose. The disagreement had crystallized all her broader concerns, making clear that the palace's vision of proper preparation conflicted with her understanding of healthy child development. She thought about the moments she treasured most with her children, the ordinary experiences that built their relationship and trust. Reading bedtime stories without rushing to the next scheduled activity, weekend mornings with unhurried breakfasts and silly conversations, school runs where they talked about their actual concerns rather than official responsibilities. These moments were the foundation of everything else. The palace proposal would systematically eliminate them, replacing family time with institutional requirements. Catherine had also considered what message acceptance would send to her children about their worth. If she and William allowed the palace to dictate these fundamental aspects of their childhood, what would George, Charlotte, and Louis learn about their right to make choices about their own lives? Would they understand that their parents had fought for them, or would they conclude that royal duty always trumped personal needs? The decision was not just about the immediate schedule changes, but about establishing principles that would shape their entire upbringing and beyond. William had spent his entire life navigating the tension between institutional expectations and personal needs. But facing these questions as a father rather than a son created entirely new complications. He remembered with painful clarity what it felt like to be the child in question, to sense that decisions about his life were being made in rooms where he had no voice. Now he possessed the power to protect his own son from those experiences, but exercising that power meant defying his father and the entire palace establishment. His relationship with King Charles had improved significantly in recent years, particularly since the Queen's passing. They spoke more openly, found more common ground, and seemed to understand each other better than they had during William's younger years. Charles had made genuine efforts to be more available and supportive, to acknowledge past mistakes and build a stronger bond. The current disagreement threatened all that progress, risking a return to the distance and disappointment that had characterized earlier periods of their relationship. William understood his father's perspective in ways that complicated his own position. Charles had waited decades for the role he now held, watching his mother's long reign while preparing for responsibilities that seemed perpetually delayed. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, shaped by his own difficult experiences and his vision for the monarchy's future. He believed deeply in the importance of proper preparation and viewed the current proposal as offering George advantages he himself had lacked. The conflicting loyalties pulled William in opposing directions with equal force. As a son, he wanted to honor his father's wishes and support his vision for the monarchy. As a father, he needed to protect his children from pressures that could damage them in ways the institution would never acknowledge or repair. As a future king, he understood the importance of preparation and continuity. As someone who had lived through inadequate childhood protection, he knew the long-term costs of prioritizing institutional needs over individual well-being. William had spent hours developing alternative proposals that might satisfy everyone. He had suggested delaying certain elements until George was older, spreading the training over a longer timeline, or maintaining more parental involvement in official appearances. Each compromise attempt had been politely received and ultimately rejected, with explanations about why the original plan's comprehensive nature and specific timing were superior. The palace machinery had no mechanism for negotiation, only for securing compliance with predetermined conclusions. His own childhood memories held both motivation and complication. He remembered times when he needed support that was not available because duty came first. He remembered his mother's frustration with the system, her attempts to create normalcy that were constantly undermined by protocol and tradition. He remembered promising himself that if he ever had children, he would do things differently. But he also remembered loving his grandmother deeply, respecting the institution she represented, and feeling genuine pride in being part of something larger than himself. The question of whether preparation required childhood sacrifice haunted him. Palace advisors insisted the two were inseparable, that future monarchs needed early and intensive training to develop necessary skills and understanding. William wondered whether that reflected genuine necessity or merely the way things had always been done. He thought about leaders in other fields who developed strong skills through gradual exposure rather than premature immersion. The palace's certainty about their approach seemed more ideological than evidence-based. William worried about the cumulative effect of years of small compromises. Accepting this proposal would establish a pattern where institutional demands consistently overrode parental judgment. Each agreement would make the next harder to resist, creating momentum toward ever-increasing palace control. He could see the path stretching ahead, leading to a future where he and Catherine became managers of their children's royal lives rather than protectors of their well-being. The slope was not just slippery, but intentionally constructed to ensure a steady descent. His military experience had taught him about the importance of clear chains of command and the dangers of divided authority. The palace proposal essentially created competing authority structures within his own family, with institutional requirements challenging parental decisions. William understood that such arrangements inevitably led to conflict and confusion, particularly for children trying to understand whose rules to follow and whose needs mattered most. The organizational dysfunction troubled him as much as the specific content of the proposal. William had also considered the political implications of his decision. Refusing the palace's request could be framed as challenging his father's authority and questioning the institutional wisdom that had sustained the monarchy through centuries. Senior royals might view resistance as a dangerous step, encouraging others to prioritize personal preferences over collective responsibility. The media would certainly seize upon any visible disagreement, turning a private family matter into public drama that could damage the monarchy's image. Yet, accepting terms he believed harmful to his children seemed like the worst possible course of action. It would teach George, Charlotte, and Louis that their parents could not or would not protect them when institutional pressure became intense. It would establish that William's promises about doing things differently were empty words, abandoned at the first real test. It would demonstrate that despite all his power and privilege, he lacked the courage to use his position to actually improve his children's lives. The approaching deadline forced William to confront questions he had been avoiding about his own values and priorities. He had always believed that family came first, that his role as a father mattered more than his role as a future king. Now he had to decide whether that belief would survive contact with serious opposition, whether he was willing to accept real consequences to defend it. The answer would define not just this moment, but his entire approach to parenting and leadership for years to come. 3 months earlier, Catherine had noticed something concerning during one of Charlotte's routine activities. It was subtle enough that she initially dismissed it as nothing, the kind of minor observation parents make constantly without alarm. But the pattern repeated, and her maternal instinct refused to let it go. She mentioned it to William one evening, and they agreed to monitor the situation carefully. Neither wanted to overreact or create worry about something that might be insignificant. After several weeks of careful observation, Catherine had scheduled a private appointment with a specialist, using personal contacts to arrange the consultation discreetly outside normal palace medical channels. The doctor had been thorough and professional, conducting examinations and tests while explaining possibilities without unnecessary alarm. The results came back showing something that needed attention and ongoing monitoring, though not immediate crisis intervention. The condition was not life-threatening, but required careful management and would influence numerous decisions about Charlotte's activities and schedule for the foreseeable future. Certain types of stress could exacerbate the situation, making it essential to maintain stability and avoid unnecessary pressure. The specialist had been clear about the importance of a calm, predictable environment during this period. While they worked to understand the full scope of the issue and develop an appropriate long-term management plan, William and Catherine had made a deliberate decision to keep this information private. They shared it only with Charlotte's regular physician and the specialist team. They had not told the king or other family members, knowing that palace awareness would trigger protocols and discussions that could complicate their management of the situation. They wanted time to understand what they were dealing with before facing questions and advice from people who would inevitably have opinions about how it should be handled. The diagnosis added crushing complexity to the palace's proposal about George. The plan would essentially disrupt family routines and increase stress levels for everyone in the household. George's expanded schedule would mean less parental availability for Charlotte exactly when she needed more support and attention. The increased media focus and public appearances would create additional pressure in an environment that needed to remain as calm and normal as possible. Charlotte's needs required the opposite of what the palace proposal would create. Catherine found herself managing impossible calculations about what she could share and what needed to remain confidential. The specialist had emphasized that Charlotte's condition was private medical information requiring her parents' protection. But that privacy made it nearly impossible to explain to palace officials why their proposal's timing was particularly difficult. Catherine could not say that their plan would directly conflict with another child's medical needs without revealing the diagnosis she was working so hard to protect. The situation also highlighted fundamental questions about palace priorities and understanding. If the institution knew about Charlotte's condition, would they modify their proposal? Or would they suggest that one child's medical needs should not interfere with another child's royal preparation? Would they show flexibility and compassion? Or would they frame Catherine's concerns as overprotective worrying? Past experience suggested that palace officials often struggled to treat royal children as individuals with genuine needs rather than institutional assets requiring proper management. William watched Catherine carrying the weight of these dual pressures, seeing how the stress affected her despite her efforts to remain calm and capable. She was managing Charlotte's situation with typical grace while simultaneously fighting to protect all 3 children from the palace's demands. She attended specialist appointments, researched the condition extensively, and maintained thorough records of Charlotte's experiences. She did all this while appearing publicly composed and continuing her official duties without visible strain. The medical situation also raised questions about what might happen if they accepted the palace proposal, and Charlotte's condition worsened under the increased family stress. Would the institution accept responsibility for having pushed changes that contributed to negative health outcomes? Would they show understanding if Catherine needed to step back from official duties to focus on her daughter? Or would they expect the family to manage privately while maintaining public obligations? Charlotte herself remained mostly unaware of how her diagnosis factored into larger family decisions. Her parents had explained her condition in age-appropriate terms, helping her understand what she was experiencing without creating anxiety about implications and management. She knew about certain adjustments to her routine, but not about the broader conflicts her situation had created. William and Catherine worked hard to keep adult pressures separate from their children's experiences, not always successfully, but with consistent effort. The timing of the palace's deadline felt particularly cruel, given Charlotte's case. The specialist recommended several months of stability to properly assess her condition and establish effective management strategies. Accepting the palace proposal would introduce major disruption exactly when medical advice called for calm consistency. But explaining this to the king would require revealing information William and Catherine had specifically chosen to protect. They were trapped between medical needs and institutional demands, with no good options for reconciling the conflict. William understood that Charlotte's situation gave them an unanswerable argument against the palace proposal if they were willing to use it. But deploying that argument meant sacrificing their daughter's privacy and potentially subjecting her to scrutiny during a vulnerable period. It meant trading one child's well-being for another's, using Charlotte's diagnosis as justification for decisions motivated by concerns about George. The ethical complications were profound, and both parents agreed that Charlotte's privacy had to be protected, regardless of the strategic advantage revelation might provide. The conversation at Adelaide Cottage had continued through the night and into the early morning, with William and Catherine circling their decision from every possible angle. They had examined their motivations, tested their reasoning, and challenged each other's assumptions. They had role-played difficult conversations with the king and imagined various scenarios that might follow their choice. As dawn broke, they both recognized that further discussion would only be delay rather than deliberation. They knew what they needed to do, even as they dreaded the consequences. Catherine spoke first when they finally addressed the decision directly, laying out her conclusion with the clarity that came from absolute certainty. She could not support a plan that she believed would harm her children, regardless of who proposed it or what institutional arguments supported it. She understood the palace's reasoning, but fundamentally disagreed with their priorities and assumptions. She was willing to face disappointment and criticism from the king and his advisors because the alternative meant betraying her responsibilities as a mother. William felt relief flood through him as Catherine insisted on the choice he had been unable to voice himself. Her certainty gave him permission to acknowledge his own, to admit that he had been searching for ways to avoid the decision rather than genuinely reconsidering it. He added his own reasoning, explaining how his childhood experiences made him unable to inflict similar pressures on George, despite understanding the institutional arguments for preparation. He talked about choosing to be the father he had needed rather than replicating the patterns that had caused him pain. They discussed the practical implications of their decision with new focus now that the main question was settled. They would need to inform the king quickly before the deadline created additional complications. They would face pressure to reconsider and would need to remain united against attempts to divide them or wear down their resistance. They would likely lose certain types of palace support and might face reduced cooperation from staff and advisors loyal to the king's vision. Their relationship with Charles would suffer damage that might take years to repair if it could be repaired at all. Catherine raised concerns about how their refusal would be framed within palace circles and potentially in media coverage if the conflict became public. They could be portrayed as difficult, overprotective, or failing to understand their responsibilities. The narrative might suggest that Catherine was leading William away from proper priorities, reviving old stereotypes about her as an outsider who did not respect royal traditions. They needed to prepare for these characterizations while maintaining their position without publicly criticizing the king or creating unnecessary drama. William acknowledged that his father would feel personally hurt by their decision, seeing it as a rejection of his judgment and his attempts to help prepare the next generation. Charles had invested significant time and thought into the proposal, genuinely believing it represented the best approach for George's future. Refusing it would sting in ways that went beyond mere disagreement about scheduling and activities. William would need to find ways to communicate respect for his father while maintaining firm boundaries about his own children's upbringing. They talked about how to present their decision in terms that might minimize damage while remaining honest about their reasoning. They would emphasize their commitment to preparing George appropriately while advocating for different timing and methods. They would acknowledge the king's good intentions while standing on their right to make final decisions about their children's lives. They would request continued dialogue about finding approaches that could satisfy everyone but still pass the message that this very proposal was unacceptable and would not be implemented. Catherine felt the weight of knowing that Charlotte's situation strengthened their position but could not be mentioned. She and William had agreed that revealing their daughter's diagnosis to justify their decision would be wrong, regardless of the strategic advantage it might provide. They would defend their choice based on general principles about childhood development and parental authority, allowing palace officials to think of them as overprotective if necessary. Charlotte's privacy mattered more than their reputation for being considerate. William thought about the broader implications of their stand for how they would navigate future conflicts between institutional expectations and family needs. This decision would test whether they could maintain boundaries against palace pressure. If they succeeded in protecting their position now, it would create space for similar stands later. If they ultimately had to compromise despite their resistance, it would reveal the limits of their actual authority and teach the palace that sustained pressure eventually produced compliance. They discussed alternative plans for various responses the king might have to their decision. If he reacted with anger, they would remain calm and request time for everyone to consider the situation before continuing the conversation. If he tried to negotiate modifications, they would listen respectfully but hold firm on core issues. If he withdrew support or created difficulties through official channels, they would document everything carefully and seek advice about appropriate responses. They were preparing for a conflict they desperately wanted to avoid but could not prevent. Catherine and William also talked about how to explain the situation to George in age-appropriate terms if the conflict became visible to the children. They did not want him to feel responsible for family tension or to develop fear about his future role. They would frame their decision as normal parental responsibility, protecting his right to be a child while still preparing him gradually for eventual duties. The goal was to emphasize that disagreements between adults were not his fault or his problem to solve. As the morning advanced and they heard sounds of the children beginning to wake, William and Catherine reached for each other's hands. They sat together quietly for a moment, acknowledging the difficulty of what lay ahead while drawing strength from their unity. Whatever consequences followed, they would face them together. They had made their choice based on their deepest values and their understanding of their children's needs. Now they needed to find the courage to defend that choice against the considerable forces that would align against it. William requested a private meeting with his father that afternoon, using the formal scheduling system to ensure availability and privacy. The king's office confirmed the appointment within an hour, the quick response suggesting that Charles had been expecting contact as the deadline approached. William felt his stomach tighten as he prepared for the conversation, running through his planned approach, while knowing that no amount of preparation could fully control how the discussion would go. He dressed in business attire rather than casual clothes, unconsciously treating the meeting as official business despite its personal nature. Catherine had offered to attend the meeting with him, presenting their decision as a united front from the beginning. William had considered this carefully before deciding to speak with his father alone. Initially, he wanted to protect Catherine from bearing the immediate brunt of Charles's disappointment, while also managing the conversation as son to father, rather than introducing an additional dynamic. He promised to report everything honestly, and to request a follow-up meeting, including Catherine, if the conversation required her direct participation. The drive to Clarence's house felt longer than usual, though William knew the actual distance had not changed. He used the time to center himself, remembering why this decision mattered, and rehearsing how to communicate respect for his father while maintaining firm boundaries. He thought about Catherine and the children at home, reminding himself that protecting them justified the discomfort he was about to endure. He acknowledged his own anxiety while refusing to let it undermine his resolve. This conversation would be difficult, but avoiding it would be worse. Charles received him in the same study where they had discussed the original proposal, a detail that felt significant, though William could not identify why. His father's expression was neutral, professionally pleasant, in the way that revealed nothing about his actual thoughts or feelings. They exchanged brief pleasantries before Charles gestured to the chairs near the fireplace, creating a setting that appeared casual, despite the tension both felt. William noticed details with unusual clarity, the way his father's fingers drummed slightly against his chair arm, the positioning of teacups that neither would likely touch. William had planned to ease into the topic gradually, but found himself speaking more directly than intended once the conversation began. He stated clearly that he and Catherine had carefully considered the palace proposal and concluded they could not accept its terms. He explained their reasoning in broad strokes, focusing on concerns about age appropriateness and the importance of protecting childhood rather than criticizing the proposal itself. He spoke steadily, watching his father's face for reactions, while trying not to let those reactions derail his explanation. When William finished his initial statement, his father remained silent for a long moment before responding. His words came slowly, each sentence revealing disappointment, while maintaining surface composure. He questioned whether William fully understood the challenges George would eventually face, and whether delaying proper preparation would serve anyone's interests. He suggested that Catherine's lack of royal upbringing might be influencing their judgment, making them overvalue ordinary childhood experiences at the expense of necessary training. The comment about Catherine triggered defensive instincts in William, but he forced himself to respond calmly rather than react emotionally. He acknowledged that his wife's perspective differed from someone raised in the system, but argued that her outside viewpoint provided valuable balance. He pointed out that his own experiences gave him insight into the costs of premature royal pressure, insight that should inform rather than be dismissed in current decisions. He tried to redirect the conversation toward finding common ground rather than defending positions. Charles shifted tactics, speaking about the institutional perspective and the many people who had contributed to developing the proposal. He described the expertise and thought that had gone into the plan, implying that rejecting it meant dismissing collective wisdom. He mentioned other senior royals who supported the approach and suggested that William and Catherine were isolating themselves through their resistance. He painted their decision as not just disagreeing with him personally, but challenging the broader royal establishment's judgment about proper preparation. William felt the weight of these arguments while recognizing them as strategic pressure rather than critical reasoning. He understood that palace officials had developed the proposal, but questioned whether their expertise in protocol and tradition translated to expertise in child development and family dynamics. He acknowledged that other royals supported the plan, but noted that those same people had supported approaches in previous generations that were now seen as problematic. He refused to accept that disagreeing meant isolation or failure to understand institutional needs. The conversation continued for over an hour, circling the central disagreement from various angles without finding resolution. Charles tried several approaches to change William's position, from emotional appeals about their improving relationship to practical warnings about the consequences of refusing institutional cooperation. William remained firm while working to keep the discussion from becoming openly hostile, seeking to preserve their personal relationship even as they failed to find agreement on this crucial issue. Both men felt the strain. Eventually, Charles seemed to accept that William would not be persuaded during this conversation, though his tone suggested he viewed the decision as temporary rather than final. He indicated that there would be further discussions, and that other family members would likely wish to express their perspectives. He made clear that palace support and cooperation would be affected by William and Catherine's refusal to follow the recommended approach. His words stopped short of explicit threats, but conveyed an unmistakable warning about the practical consequences of their choice. William left the meeting feeling drained but relieved to have stated his position clearly. The conversation had gone as badly as he had feared in some ways, but he had maintained his composure and his resolve. He knew this was only the beginning of a longer conflict, that pressure would continue and potentially intensify. But he had taken the first crucial step of making his decision known and refusing to be immediately talked out of it. He called Catherine from the car to report on the conversation, hearing the support and solidarity in her voice, despite her disappointment about his father's response. Back at Adelaide Cottage that evening, William and Catherine talked through what had happened and what would likely come next. They discussed which other family members might contact them and how to respond to various pressure approaches. They confirmed their commitment to each other and to their decision, acknowledging the difficulty ahead while drawing strength from their unity. They were braced for consequences they could anticipate and preparing to handle those they could not yet imagine. Do you believe William and Catherine are making the prudent choice by breaking away from established protocols? Let us know your perspectives in the comments section below. If you found this video engaging, please like and subscribe to this channel. Before you depart, be sure to watch the other videos appearing on your screen now.